I'm Matt Ross, the Editorial Director of Global Government Forum. Thanks for joining us today at this webinar, which is run in association with Deloitte on the topic Recover and Thrive, Regulating Mobility in a Disrupted World. Over the next 90 minutes, we'll be hearing from transport specialists from the public and private sectors on the benefits and challenges of using data in transport management and service delivery. The event's split into 3 sections, and after each set of discussions, we'll be putting questions from the audience to the panelists. So during the event, please do submit your questions for the speakers using the Q&A box at the foot of the Zoom window. You just type them in there. We'll be keeping an eye. You can submit general queries or specific questions for the individuals. If you don't want us to use your name when we read out the question, then please do add a note there alongside the question. And any questions we don't address during the event, we'll get back to you afterwards with an answer. So everybody's question will receive some response. We're also, after the event, going to be publishing a report which we will send out to everybody, along with a link to the download of this event, which will all be available on demand indefinitely. Now, the event is going to be moderated by Simon Dixon, Deloitte's Global Transportation Leader. So I'll hand straight to him. Simon.
Thank you, Matt, and welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending where you are on the world. And thank you very much for making the time to join us for what I hope will be a fascinating webinar on the subject, as said, of regulating mobility in a disrupted world. Just a couple of things about that. The disruption, we are all experiencing disruption at the moment, and the COVID crisis is causing a lot of breaks to the norm. But when we talk about disruption in the transportation and the mobility world, we're also thinking about how it's being disrupted by other things before and after COVID. And what's the impact of new technologies? What's the impact of changing citizen behaviors? There's a whole lot of disruption going on in our industry, and our speakers are going to be drawing out some of those themes. So before I kick off the first session, what we're going to do is we're going to have a bit of audience participation. So there's going to be a few poll questions, and there's essentially going to be one poll question before each of the 3 main speaking slots. These questions, when you answer, is completely anonymous, and it's just to give a rough feel on a topic that actually will hopefully introduce and tee up the next set of speakers. So Maria, if you're able to put the first question up, that would be great. So I'm going to give you a 30 seconds to answer it. Should be a fairly easy one, yes or no. Do, on the whole, you think the current set of data regulations provide a lot more benefits, or do you think the costs and complexities are more hassle than they're worth? Completely anonymous, just a rough what you feel. So Maria, have we got quite a lot of answers coming in? And here we are. So actually, 60-40 on average, the majority of you feel that actually data regulations are, on the whole, more beneficial than the hassles we often hear about sometimes. So actually, I think that hopefully is going to provide a great piece for our first topic, which is all about enabling data sharing, emerging principles for transforming urban mobility. And I'm really pleased to introduce Piyush Pandey, who's Deloitte's Global Smart City Cyber Leader, who's going to kick off this session. We're going to have 20 minutes of discussion between Piyush and Thomas, and then there'll be a sort of 10-minute Q&A session. Over to you, Piyush.
Well, thank you, Simon, and thank you all for joining today, and especially taking time out from your busy schedule, as we all acknowledge that how busy government agencies are across the globe to support critical operations. So truly appreciate your time today to join this very important conversation. And let me just set the context in the offset that the cities are becoming a big data epicenter, which if used effectively and intelligently, so to speak, it can enable more efficient and more sustainable mobility systems. But in order to use and share this data, a framework is needed that allows aggregation of data from wide range of sources, from connected infrastructure, from the vehicles, from the smartphones, from roadways, and many more in-field devices that are out there. And this framework can, in theory, provide a very detailed and almost like a real-time picture of the urban environment, which in turn will drive efficiencies, both from the operational standpoint, as well as it can also enable many new services to improve customer interactions and satisfaction. However, the sharing, collection, and use of this data comes with a very unique set of risks, not just for the individuals and entities to whom the data corresponds, but to the organizations and operators of the mobility ecosystem who access, store, and share this information. Specifically, the risk around the privacy and data protection of how this data will be used for its intended purpose, how it will be secured as it actually transfers and moves in the ecosystem of stakeholders and entities and devices through various different channels. Whether a competitor will be able to take undue business advantage, or ethical concerns around whether the data can be used to amplify systemic biases, or a plain simple inability to fully realize the vision of and value of data because of the lack of skills to analyze and process it. So these are the issues and many more inhibiting the data sharing within the various different stakeholders of the ecosystem. So with this objective to really tackle the issues, World Business Council for Sustainable Business Development, WBCSD, in partnership with Deloitte and over 20 global mobility companies, led an initiative to create a common ground between the stakeholders and then define a set of principles that can be used to shape the data sharing model for futures. So today we have with us Thomas Deloyson from WBCSD to elaborate on the emerging principles for data sharing that has been developed. So over to you, Thomas.
Thank you very much, Piyush, and thank you very much to everyone for having me today with you. And I think you have done a great job in explaining what are the key barriers and the difficulties to data sharing. And maybe I want to start by explaining that we at WBCSD, together with our business members, we all believe that data sharing is the next frontier. It is already in many places playing a big role in making mobility more sustainable. Maybe a quick word of introduction of the World Business Council. We are a not-for-profit organization that aims at advancing the topic of sustainable development. Our members are the businesses of the world, and we are led by the CEOs of these members in order to address the topics of sustainable development with the vision of achieving a planet of 9.5 billion people on which people live and thrive. The topic of data sharing has been extremely important to the members, specifically on the mobility project and the mobility topic, because obviously data is seen as a very significant market. There is an enormous opportunity. I think it was estimated over $1 trillion of dollars to be by 2025 overall the overall size of the market. So that is obviously, before even we talk about COVID, something that is of materiality. But the other element maybe that we want to mention is that there are some cases and emerging cases that we see happening in various cities and geographies of the world, which essentially are starting to address some of the most deeply rooted problems of the mobility in urban environment. And these cases, as you would know, are mobility as a service cases. They relate to logistics, they relate to accessibility, they relate to congestion pricing or any other. But essentially, this is just the tip of the iceberg. As I mentioned, we do believe that this is for transport the next frontier. And so what I'd like to propose in terms of thinking framework for this discussion is two things. First is, let's try to understand, based on the current trends and before COVID and because of COVID, what are the key drivers of change that will lead us to the more usage of data and more sharing of data in the urban environment, so that we can understand what can really catalyze data sharing. I think first, obviously, at the macro level, we have an economic crisis that is emerging, and we will have to face it for the next years. And this is obviously creating distress, whether it's economic or whether it's social. There's a lot of inequality that is going to emerge in urban environment related to accessibility of transport, accessibility to jobs, and others. So it is from an overall perspective a little bit of an emergency situation. Now, if we focus on transport itself, we have seen several key changes happening, and we hope that they are going to be solved for some of them, but also continue for the others. So first, I think we all have witnessed the public transit systems being put under what physicians and mechanics call the resilience test, because the passenger ridership has been reducing a lot, and operations have become more complex, capacity is becoming a major issue. So really public transit is under a lot of stress, and we'll have to prove to be resilient. Micromobility was the big winners of the years 2018 and 19, has got a little bit of a reset. We have all witnessed the closure of some of the players of micromobility, or the layoffs of some others. But we also see now, especially in regions where COVID lockdown is ending, the micromobility players coming back with a new mindset, a mindset where operations have to be managed more efficiently. Vehicles have to be, I would say, the assets that are the vehicles are to be better utilized. So this is for me what I would call quite a positive reset. And of course, the big winners of the lockdown and the period are the active modes. We have seen the rush for public space and the creation of bike lanes and somehow the safe and pop-up sometime infrastructure that will enable more active modes, which obviously call for courageous, I would say, municipalities to take the space and off the cars and to the active mode. So that's a very positive trend from a sustainable mobility perspective. And finally, the e-commerce has been booming, and so e-commerce is therefore submitted to quite a lot of constraints when it comes to efficiency and resilience to a very strong growth. And there again, the topic of space and curb management, as well as efficiency for the resilience that I've mentioned, is key. So that was just a quick overview of what we have noticed at the WBCSD in terms of emerging trends. And we think that these and help us to grasp a little bit what will be the key drivers of change when it comes to data. And to our perspective, the requirement for additional revenues from cities and from the operators of transport, whether they are public or private, as well as the need to manage better space more efficiently, are the key drivers for adopting data sharing as one of the solutions. The question now is really how. How can this data sharing happen? And Piyush has outlined some of the barriers and some of the enablers to data sharing. We at WBCSD, together with 20 companies from the wider mobility ecosystem, have released back in January a set of principles that we think are the basics, the fundamentals of enabling data sharing in urban environment. The principles relate to the creation of value. We believe that data sharing should and must enable all stakeholders to create value. Data sharing has to be private, has to protect privacy and should incorporate a protection of privacy by design. Data sharing has to be ethical, and Piyush mentioned it. It has to avoid to be biased and obviously to be inclusive. The data sharing for us has to embrace cybersecurity by design, and I think Piyush will have more to tell us about this in a moment. And finally, and this is an important point, data sharing needs to be adaptive and iterative, meaning that it needs to be able to embrace the longer term and is not just there to solve a use case. Now, we have some barriers, and some of the barriers of data sharing are emerging. We all are very concerned about the topic of privacy, and the need to protect the users when it comes to their data. Here we believe that tools like balanced and transparent governance are essential to protect privacy. And that is something that needs to be done with the public, with the civil society. We also think that the ability to create some kind of ethical body within this governance will also help to protect privacy and to ensure the ethical use of data. And if I take a comparison in medicine and for doctors, there are ethical groups in hospitals and in universities. Why not do the same for data? And that brings me to the point of academics. We tend to, I would say, give the role of academics for research and for nitty-gritty, let's say, studies and surveys. But in fact, academics can play a very important role in the governance of data sharing in order to protect privacy. There has been some cases recently where privacy has become the main concern of the population and has led to some actions in order to that has been impacting some of the projects. And I'm thinking about the waterfront project of Toronto, which indeed has closed recently or has ended recently on the back of the COVID crisis. But privacy was clearly a big topic there. We've seen recently another interesting example with the MDS standard, which was established in Los Angeles, where through the aggregation of data, privacy was a little bit exposed, and there is a case ongoing on this. And so I think these are not to be pointed to with, this is not just to point fingers, this is more to say that things are happening and there are intentions and trials on the topic of data sharing, and it's only beneficial to these limits. I'll talk about a second barrier now, before maybe we can talk a little bit more about cybersecurity with Piyush. But the other big topic of data sharing is competition. We have a lot of resistance from whether it's the private sector and sometimes also the public sector to share the data, because there is a notion of losing the access to the user and somehow losing this competitive advantage that has created the service that is currently being sold. And so in this we want to bring a couple of elements for proceeding with data sharing and trying to break or go over this barrier. The first one is making sure that everybody understands deeply, and it's more a matter of, it's really a matter of mindset somehow, that the value that exists in data only exists because it's shared. It's only because a customer wanted to share its data or his or her data with a company that the service can be rendered or can be created. And this should never be forgotten, because this is really at the center of our philosophy here. It is about sharing, and it is about finding value in sharing. The other element of value and that we think is important to mention in order to solve the competition barrier is related to making the people understand that the benefits, and whether it's the financial benefits or what we would call the more, I would say, indirect value, resides not only in the immediate exchange of data to create an add-on service to the service that is already existing, but very often will appear at the periphery of the service or the sector in which an operator is operating. The example will be clearly on the public side, on the public good of things, like health, for example, where we think that if we can manage better an overall emission or zero emission plan in the city, clearly it's going to have some benefits on health and the environment. We can also think about data sharing examples where we can facilitate access of transport to the most vulnerable populations of the city, trying to create a real social benefit from this. And so we want to explain, and we are trying to give the message that essentially the elements of competition can be overcome if every party understands that the value is often residing at the periphery of the case. Finally, and this is not to be forgotten, data sharing will trigger innovation. And that's again back to the role of academics. It is absolutely essential to to understand for all the stakeholders that would share data, that if there is an opportunity for innovation, it will be with the data sharing. And when we see how some sectors are currently suffering from the crisis and from the inherent disruption, whether it's technological or behavioral, that was already existing, and I'm thinking about the automotive sector in particular, there is an enormous opportunity for strategic innovation there. So maybe to finalize before I hand over back to Piyush, just to mention that we believe that the opportunities are huge when it comes to data sharing, and that it's really about finding the right use cases. We have outlined several that we think have impact, but we will continue this work, and we aim to create this global framework for policy making on data sharing with many initiatives and organizations. And we believe that this is absolutely relevant of work, because as long as there is a vision locally, we can make it happen. It is just a matter of collaborating between the public and the private sector to create value. I'll end there maybe, and Piyush, if you want to comment a little bit.
Absolutely, and thank you, Thomas. That was a great overview. And I'm going to actually take one aspect of data sharing and elaborate it a little bit more, which is cybersecurity and privacy. And this is the one which undergirds any future data sharing framework that will take effect. Let me just take a point which Thomas, you mentioned. It was a very interesting point that as the government agencies, and especially transit sector, as they are shifting from responding to this global pandemic and then now moving to more of a recovery stage, the transit sector in particular is expected to see a new wave of digital transformation. And then the focus this time will be on enabling safe environment. And some of the solutions around the no-touch, contactless, wireless technologies for payments and security controls around biometrics and connected devices, for example, to manage occupancy of vehicles and in public transit. New digital platforms will come into play, which is to optimize the supply chain, food and freight delivery solutions. These solutions will, as they integrate in our mass transit system, as more train and subway systems start to connect, the greater the number of ways to have the data sharing and requirement for it, but the greater ways for the malicious actors to really start to penetrate and cause disruption. And this is where the cybersecurity needs to be looked at a more holistical state, where addressing all the different layers of this complex transit ecosystem that you talked about. And just to give you the glimpse of, and most of you are aware of the complexity of this ecosystem, but just to start off with, we have in any given transit ecosystem, we have a numerous diverse set of stakeholders, from consumers to suppliers, the manufacturers, the multiple levels of governments, the operators, and then you have a complex set of technologies, the vehicles, autonomous vehicles, devices, entities, on-field devices that are there, toll collection, weather station, and you name it. The list goes on and on. And this is an ever-expanding ecosystem of information and communication technologies. So the cyber in this complex and interconnected world is very different from the cybersecurity that we see in a traditional sense. And if you think about it, there are three factors that really drives the cyber risk in this complex ecosystem. The convergence of cyber and physical system, the interoperability between the legacy and the various newer systems and devices that keep adding to the transit ecosystem, and then this integration or interconnectedness of transportation with other sectors and services. So let's take the first one, the cyber-physical convergence. It is the integration of IT systems with the in-field operational system. These are the operational systems which are critical components that are responsible for the control, movement, and monitoring of the transportation equipments, whether it's a train track or signal control, and many more. This convergence enables the efficiencies from the operational standpoint, brings the automation, but it also combines the vulnerabilities from the IT world to the operations technology world, which was confined to its own boundaries till now. And that can impact the physical operation. It can impact the safety and human life ultimately if the operational equipments are manipulated. And there are many cases around that, which has happened in the past. Interoperability, we have seen a lot, but in today's mobility system, it is common to find a legacy equipment which has a life cycle of 30 years to working side by side with the newer solutions that we are integrating every day. And most of these aged legacy components were never designed with the cybersecurity in mind. But the third factor, which is the integration within different sectors, that is the most fascinating one, because this is where the future of mobility and the integration with this smart cities comes into play. Here, transportation infrastructure integrates with the many distinct sectors of the cities, whether from healthcare, utilities, and the idea is to drive the efficiencies, share that information, and bring the more use cases and more services, more solution in an urban setup. Yeah. But due to this high degree of interconnections,
Piyush, can I break in there, because I want to try and get everyone going, but there's been quite a few questions, and it's a fascinating topic, as you can see from you and Thomas. But really, maybe Thomas, we talked about governance within countries, but what would you think about cross-border data sharing, and particularly, where do you think the balance should be? Should governments leave things to the private sector, or should they leave things, they should regulate themselves and make sure they're joined up across the borders?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question and quite a complex one to answer. But let me try to give a couple of elements. And I'm always tempted to make some parallels. I mean, if you think about the banking system, for example, there has been some ways at global level and consortium at global level that has established the standards for the governance of data, whether it's to address privacy or cybersecurity. And I'm thinking about the SWIFT standard or consortium, for example. What is every bank now using when it comes to protocols for exchanges of data, securing the exchange? That's, to me, the kind of ways forward. I'm struggling to see beyond the regions that have been established, like Europe or United States or like the country level. I'm struggling to see how we can achieve a truly cross-border data sharing agreement in the short term without having basically a consortium of players, whether they are private or academic, going together and defining these rules together, so that it will also influence the public on the second stage.
I think that's a really good point about the consortium. You touched on it a bit earlier about trust, and you alluded to the trust of both the public and governments trusting other governments. There's been a reasonably well publicized case in Toronto where a smart city project really got canned because there wasn't a sufficient level of trust. I don't know if you've got any thoughts about that, either you or Piyush.
Yeah, no, and that is the crux of it, because the privacy is one of the issue which, and security obviously, which Undergird said, but the privacy is an important topic in each of these data sharing initiatives. And then ability for citizens to have that control over their information and what information they share and where that information is being used and for what purpose is the key for any future model. And when we have that transparency in a data sharing framework, I think that's where the success will start to trickle in.
If I may add one thought on this one, I think with the case of Toronto, one element that was striking to me is the very technologically driven vision of the local players, and we know who was operating there and what was the kind of ambition for a fully technologic district of the city. I think the vision there has probably missed one point, which is the buy-in from the public. Back to the point from Piyush, if the public buys in the vision, if the public understands that this is going to be of value and of public good, but similarly, so that the vision maybe is readjusted to what the public is ready to accept. I think this is another way, again, through collaboration and consultation, to create that trust. And it will be different case by case. The people of Toronto will have different willingness from the people of Paris. I mean, Paris and privacy is going to be an interesting discussion.
Yeah, I think that is interesting, different attitudes. We see this a lot in transportation. What works well in one region might not work well in another. And we talk a lot about active transport, walking and cycling. It's brilliant in Amsterdam. You know, I think in our index it said 63% of all journeys by walking or cycling. But you're not really going to be cycling around Dubai in the middle of the summer. So I think those global attitude to government privacy, you know, is really important. And there isn't really a one size fits all. I think actually, guys, I'm going to draw stumps on that one, that section. We'll have a chance maybe to pick up at a general bit of Q&A at the end, and I'm really going to move on to our second segment. So Maria, if you could possibly put up the next polling question. So really this one is just, what do you think about integrated transportation versus siloed transportation? Do you think your part of the world, your city, your geography is really moving towards managing and looking after transport unified, or is it still in its separate silos? So just a yes or no, and again, we've got about 30 seconds for that. I'm very much hoping that we'll see loads of yeses, but I fear we might see that we're still in the old silos. So Maria, if you could flip it up and see what we've got. Yeah, unfortunately, though, actually more positives than I was perhaps worried about. So 45% of you think that there is an integrated approach to transportation, but 55% of you think it's still siloed. I take comfort from the fact that I would bet a lot of money that if we'd asked this question about 5 years ago, we'd have seen the no's well up into the 80s. So thanks very much for that, which really segues nicely onto our second segment, which is really, it's all about how we're moving towards a mobility strategy framework. And to lead off this session, I'm really pleased to introduce Rana Sen, a colleague of mine, who's the Deloitte US Smart City and Transportation Lead. Rana, over to you.
Thanks, Simon, and thanks to all the participants as well for taking time and to be on this webinar. As we have observed over the last several years now, that the entire way people and goods travel from point A to point B has been changing, and that has been enabled by several converging business models, technologies, and also changes in societal expectations around sustainability, convenience, efficiencies, and equitable distribution. We have also seen increasing viability of electric vehicles, new materials, lightweight materials being introduced, and this notion of a promise towards cheaper, cleaner, safer mobility ecosystem. And obviously right now the world is grappling with the global pandemic and its consequences in regard to public health, in regard to potential prolonged economic downturn as well. And more, there are increasing concerns on what the new mobility ecosystem outlook will be, given some of these circumstances, given some of the disruptions that already begun before the pandemic, and obviously being exacerbated by the current situation. I'm privileged to speak with Faye DeMassimo today about this topic. Faye is currently a senior advisor to the mayor of the Metropolitan Government of Nashville and Davidson County for transportation and infrastructure. She brings years of deep experience and thinking on this topic, and also a former colleague of ours. Faye, thank you for being on the panel this morning with us. So Faye, given the context and given again the answer to the polling question around unified strategy vis-a-vis a bit of more of a siloed approach in the past, I know in your role you have been thinking about a mobility strategy for to serve your constituents. Do you want to maybe start off with laying out some of your thinking in this regard, and then obviously we have a few more follow-up questions on this very interesting and intriguing topic.
Sure. Thank you so much, Rana, and thank you for the opportunity to join this panel this morning. I think many of the participants who are local government will find what we're going to discuss will really resonate. But I wanted to set the stage for Nashville in particular before I talk about our mobility strategy. I don't know if there's a local government that is enjoying, and I use that term obviously tongue-in-cheek, more disruption than Nashville right now. So Mayor Cooper was elected this past fall, took office, and inherited definitely a very challenging budgetary and financial situation to be overcome. But Nashville's always been a very successful area, booming economy, and so forth. So there was the first challenge, but then we moved very quickly into, we had a tornado that disrupted a lot of the core area of our city, caused some tremendous damage, and literally about a week and a half later, the pandemic started. So between financial disruption, weather disruption, and then the pandemic disruption and the resulting economic impacts of that, all the while the mayor has a key initiative around a new mobility plan and a new mobility strategy for Nashville. You can imagine why having these kinds of frameworks became even more important to ensure that we overcame any siloed approach and that we were very much driven to performance. So I know several of the other panelists have mentioned trust, and I think no doubt about it that data is the way that we are able to feed the kinds of performance frameworks that we need in order to be successful in this space. But trust in how we collect that data, how we use that data, and how we protect that data are all a core part of having performance-driven mobility. There's three ways or three streams that we're thinking about how we have organized our framework around driving that, that performance in the mobility space. The first is the policy management piece. And it's probably the most important. We've got to set that framework around what is it that we're trying to accomplish and how are we going to accomplish it, and how do we set again, these performance expectations around it. How is that policy management vision shared with our residents, our businesses, our visitors? How is it shared with our council members? And how are we using it and able to use it on a day-to-day basis? It really is the essential framework around accomplishing what we want to do. So the policy management framework thread is critical, and followed by the infrastructure management. So we have our policy framework around driving these mobility enhancements, this connectivity, the equity in our community, and so forth. We've also got to be able to manage that infrastructure effectively. How are we delivering it? How are we delivering it both cost effectively, efficiently? How are we thinking about the impacts of it? You know, we talk a lot about data, and data is really not the end of the game. The people that are on the other end of that data are always the end of the game. We're really managing to people, not to transit or to rail or to cars or to any of those kinds of things. We're managing to people, and we're talking about moving people. And so the policy management around that, then the management of the infrastructure, including the digital component of our infrastructure, and then lastly, the operations management. So we've got the policy of what we want to achieve, we've got the infrastructure the delivery of what we're trying to achieve. And once we've delivered it, then how do we operate it? And being able to have strong operation systems, including those that manage risk around some of the components, for example, like micromobility, that are present in many systems around the world. All of those things have to work together. So it's not just about the silos of data and so forth. It's even about the silos, breaking down those silos of how we accomplish the delivery of the systems. I think of it as we're, we've got to have these strong management components, but back to the comment that I made about we're really not managing data, we're managing to those people that are on the other end of that data and to making a difference in lives every day. So we've got to manage with both our head and our hearts in terms of delivering the great performance and mobility systems that modern cities like Nashville desire.
Thanks, Faye, for some of the details around this, this complex ecosystem. I know you also have been, thinking about not just, giving the citizens and the residents a seat at the table, like you said. This is about making a difference in people's lives at the end of the day. But also about specific performance outcomes, and how do you, from an infrastructure management, both physical and digital, and operations management, how you put some of those metrics in place? How do you continue to measure performance, and obviously then make the necessary changes required in that regard? Could you comment a little bit more about that, Faye, in terms of the thinking that you have had, and what might be some ideas for our participants on the webinar as well?
Well, one of the things that I think is critical, and it's one of the things that Nashville's doing now, is the performance aspect of our metro government is not just established for the work that we're doing in the mobility and infrastructure space, but it's established for all of Metro. So in the mayor's office, there is a leadership that's all around innovation and performance management. And we all participate in that in a way where you understand, for example, we're talking about how we use this to, how we're using this to drive performance and mobility, but driving performance and mobility also means we're driving economic performance. It also means we're driving performance in equity. It also means we're driving performance perhaps in the health space. So the interconnectedness of the data sharing and how we use the data, again, to drive performance that makes a difference in the lives of people is something that I think is important that it be viewed in a much more holistic way, and that those relationships and influences across the entire spectrum of a typical local government, set of activities is a part of how you manage, and it is a part of how we manage, and I think it's been super helpful.
Yeah, and it goes back to some of the items already discussed in regard to the role of transportation, which literally sits at the core of these different dimensions of economic growth, public health, education, and essentially all dimensions of of civic society, and how it impacts the movement as we look ahead. One of the polling questions that we had earlier on this webinar around the role of government vis-a-vis market-driven, and it was an interesting observation I had that from the participants, where majority of them, did indicate an inclination towards more of a regulated approach, if you will, if I'm not mistaken in my observation in that regard. What's your point of view around, more of a market structured vis-a-vis more of a regulated approach, because, as we probably can all, excuse me, acknowledge that some of the disruptions, the technologies, the business models that have come about have outpaced regulation. And there's a bit of catch up that is happening right now. But at the same time, we also acknowledge that the government being the steward and also kind of the convener, if you will, are a couple of these roles that would come to mind, does play a role to not only enable innovation, but also safeguard the interests of the citizens, of the residents. What are some of the the new ways of thinking that you have, Faye, and that you have seen with your other colleagues in this space as well?
So I think you have to have some of both the regulatory perspective as well as that of the market-driven piece of that. Both are important. Now, I'll give you an example specific to Metro Nashville that we're working on now. Is like many other cities and many other locations, micro-mobility came to us and the market was there, and especially around scooters in particular, the market was there, and it took over the market, and there really was no, it met a market need that we had really not recognized on the public side, but yet we didn't have a framework, management, regulatory, or otherwise, to really be able to ensure that the performance was one that would also meet our needs around whether it's safety or whatever those things might be. So what we did was, after a first sort of engagement with a number of different providers over the last several years in that space, is we have crafted a request for proposal that is, rather than us trying to regulate, we want to let the market do what the market does best, which is help us bring that innovation and that thought around how we can do things that we may not be actively involved in or in the development of, but yet we're providing the performance framework and the performance metrics around what it is we want to achieve. And you can call that regulatory, but I think it's more of this: set forth our performance expectations of what we need in order to have successful operations within our communities, and then let the market help tell us how we can best do that. So I think that there's a blend of both performance and regulatory pieces that have to come together in order to really achieve best performance.
Faye, I think I would be remiss if I don't bring in the topic of the implications of the global pandemic into our discussion, given that it's obviously top of mind for all of us. And as we kind of look at it, we are already seeing a couple of new paradigms emerging. For example, one being the definition of safety, which we should think about in terms of, pedestrian, fatalities or accidents. We should think about vehicle crashes, but that definition has now expanded, and that definition has now included, safety options around sanitization, clean transit options, and then the other dimension also that we are seeing is, how in many of the cities globally, and obviously we are seeing that in US as well, as the economy is moving towards reopening, some of the repurposing of the current infrastructure towards more active modes of either providing more bike lanes or walking paths, options for the use of the sidewalk or expanding those for dining options, and really helping the local economy to open up and provide some of these new modes of usage, if you will. Any thoughts in this regard, Faye, from a policy management that you spoke about, and how some of these implications need to be really accounted for, at least over the next 3 years, if not beyond that?
Sure. I think that there's never been a time when it's more important and begged exactly by the situation that you just so well described, Rana, for local governments to be more nimble, more creative, more innovative than they've ever been, especially in this space. I think that we don't know yet. I think the economy is just starting to reemerge. I don't think we know exactly what that's going to look like yet. I think that there's still outstanding questions about the pandemic, obviously, and future potential impacts from that may recur. There's so many different pieces. There's no doubt that our practices, as you were describing, whether it's around safety or other things, I think it's going to reshape and reframe the mobility space for a very long time. And I don't think we know what all of those specifics are yet. They are coming at us even as we speak. But what is really critical is local governments have got to be more nimble, more innovative, more creative, and more tolerant in that change space than what is traditional, at least I think in the United States and probably a lot of other places, in order to manage this effectively through the policy, infrastructure, and operations threads that we talked about earlier in our discussion.
Thanks, Faye.
Thank you, Faye. Simon, I think I'll bring you into this discussion now. There are probably some questions that you may have, and also the participants may have a few questions as well.
There's been some interesting questions, and Faye, one which I think you may be able to answer from the audience. There's a great disparity between the capacity and capability of transportation systems in the cities and in the rural areas. And we talk a lot, and a lot of our solutions are about cities. Is there anything that you've experienced in your career about what lessons and how can the rural communities benefit from some of these initiatives?
Absolutely. So I think that the one thing that is common, or there's probably a number of things that are common, but the thing that strikes me as most common between urban and rural areas is the need for connectivity, and the need for reliable connectivity. And so the ways that we may achieve those in those different settings can be different, but some of those fundamental sort of lessons learned, some of those fundamental approaches can be scalable and transplantable in either of those kinds of markets. And so I think it's really important that it becomes more back to the question, and I'm very heartened by the response that we got to the polling question on the front end of our panel with regard to silos. I think it becomes even more important that governments and those private sector as well, that we are sharing where those what those solutions are and what those approaches are, and that we're helping each other. Certainly, this pandemic has driven home the importance of community and the importance of connection. And whether you're in an urban area or a rural area, you need access to employment, you need in economics, you need access to healthcare, you need access to education. Those are common things, and how we can accomplish those things with some different tools that might be more scalable and transplantable across those markets is important, but it means that we've all got to help each other.
Thanks, Faye. I think it's the need to think imaginatively. And one of the examples I've heard sort of is in New South Wales, that they were using their buses, which were mainly busy in the peaks doing the first mile, last mile, and then the school buses, which were busy in the mornings of the drop-off in the evenings, but were then sitting underutilized during the day, were then being repurposed to do social needs, taking elderly people in the rural areas to hospitals. And I thought that was a great example of thinking differently out of the box about how to use assets. I think, and it be, sorry, Faye, go on.
No, same point is not only how do we use assets, but how do we use technology in those, because oftentimes our rural areas are not as connected in the technology space, but technology is another one of those tools that has great application in both environments. How do we make sure that that is available and that, you know, the notions around urban and rural equity, if you will, are met with all of the tools in our toolkit?
Yeah, I think we might touch on it in the later session, but there was another question from the audience about how do you stop big players from dominating with their balance sheets and taking over? And are a lot of these solutions very expensive? I actually think that the regulation and the role of the governments regulating to encourage a level playing field and competition, and regulating to break down the silos can actually have a dramatic impact and don't cost so much. So I'm kind of optimistic about where it's going.
Completely agree.
Just flipping up another subject is, I've often been talking when I talk about transportation of how if you can't move goods and people efficiently in and around your cities, between your cities and between your countries, you don't have much of an economy. And unfortunately, this COVID has rather demonstrated that that's true in spades. But you touched on it, but are there any other good examples of how the role of transportation can improve equality, which I think is a really important subject?
How it can improve the quality of
equality, make societies better, fairer.
Oh, well, another thing that this pandemic has driven home is the notion around and that's core to quality of any community, is the notion of equity. How does everyone have an opportunity to participate? How is everyone impacted in the same kinds of ways? No, they're impacted differently. And oftentimes our most vulnerable communities are those that are impacted. As a matter of fact, that's pretty unfortunately routine, is that the most vulnerable communities are those that are impacted the most. And so back to what you were just mentioning is how we use our policy frameworks, our regulatory frameworks, the infrastructure that we provide, and how we operate it to break down and break down the silos and create greater connectivity. And that we're very intentional about how we aim for that quality across everyone who's in our systems and everyone who needs mobility, as well as many, many other kinds of services in our community in order to have just a successful life, is very important. And that's why I mentioned at the beginning of this, is that it's always tempting to get lost in the numbers and the data performance metrics and all those kinds of things. But remember, at the end of every piece of data is somebody that we're trying to make their life better.
That's great. And one last question before I move on to our next set of panelists. Rana and Faye, both of you, a question from the audience. San Diego are definitely using digital twins to drive optimization and innovation. Rana and I are both working with them. But is Nashville adopting any similar digital twin technologies to try and work out the best way to optimize your assets?
We are. Nashville is in a growth stage in that area. I would say that we're in the preliminary stages of that. But we are certainly in the development stages and are focused on that being a much needed activity for us.
And just to add to that, Simon, as well, given the new paradigm shift, if you will, and the transportation infrastructure policy makers, planners on the webinar would probably also agree, is there's been in the past a focus and a lot of work around the what is, if you will, scenarios and analysis thereof. And I think increasingly there's also a focus on more of the what if at the same time. So the distinction between the what is and the what if, and the digital twin technologies, the new modeling and simulation platforms that are now capable of granular level what if analysis is, I think, a tool in that set of toolkits, if you will, that the planners now have at their disposal for precisely the type of granular level modeling that is necessary. And the other thing I'll just quickly add is, in the US, for example, I know that there's also a focus and a mandate around travel demand modeling to forecast, let's say, infrastructure improvements, congestion, so on and so forth. But now the notion that we're increasingly seeing from many of the cities and government, transportation agencies is around transportation demand modeling, which goes beyond just the travel demand concept, but more looking at the ecosystem holistically. And Faye, you probably agree with that perspective as well.
Brilliant. We couldn't have planned it better as a segue into our next section. So Rana and Faye, thank you so much for teeing up. I'm sure there'll be more questions there are in the Q&A, which we can answer maybe at the end or we'll deal with offline. But thank you very much for that really great talk.
Thank you.
If now, Maria, we're going to move on to our third segment and our last question. We're going to change it up a bit because this time we've got 2 questions to ask you. And instead of just a simple yes or no, we've got a few more little answers. So could you have a look at these? The first one is about how much mobility data does your organization make it available externally? Do you keep it in-house or do you share it a lot? And the second question is, do you think that the current regulations for data sharing, are they actually are they a hindrance or they are an enabler, or no real opinion? So if you'd have a look at those questions, we'll give it another sort of 20-30 seconds and then we'll move into the next session. Okay, Maria, if you just maybe flip up the answers. Interesting. So I was rather hoping the first one would be a lot, but I still think there's a little bit of guarding of data. And, the current regulations are almost too weak. So that's very interesting. So hopefully that will tee up a few things for the next section. So our third and final topic is all around data-driven mobility and a case study from a UK transport operator. I'm really pleased. We've got a great fun session and it'll build on what we talked about digital twins in the last one. So I'm going to turn it over to Nadoon Muthukamarana, who's Deloitte's lead partner for transport analytics and AI in the UK. Nadoon.
Thank you, Simon. Hi, everyone. It was a great segue from the last session. People starting to talk about using simulation and a what-if scenario simulation as a great way to making decisions and to make informed decisions going forward, especially in the post-pandemic scenario where a lot of things are unprecedented. So, in fact, we just very recently published a paper talking about how you would use what-if scenario planning to navigate the new normal. So I think both data sharing as an ecosystem is critical in being able to do those what-if scenario simulations using fresh and up-to-date data rather than being able to rely on very historic type of data. Equally, regulation is a very interesting topic, as we just asked you in the polling question. Regulation into mobility services are very much fixed in many cases, right? And then again, in situations like COVID, we now see different patterns emerging in the way you need to deliver transport and mobility services, and one size doesn't fit all. So again, we are exploring and having very interesting conversations around how regulation needs to be done in a way that it gives you the flexibility to flex up and down and respond to dynamic sort of situations. Now, to bring all of this to life, it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to a long-standing customer of mine, Alex Schock, who heads up program delivery and data at Network Rail. Network Rail being the UK's largest network operator, but also the largest infrastructure operating organization. But I'll get Alex to both introduce himself first and also to tell you a little bit about what Network Rail does, and then we'll go into a dialogue to cover some of the topics we discussed.
Thank you very much, Nadoon and Simon, and good morning, afternoon, evening. I don't know about anybody else on the audience, but the mornings and the evenings just seem to blur into one at the moment. So it doesn't really matter where you are in the world. I think we're all in the same boat at the moment. Thank you for having me. As Nadoon said, I run the head of delivery on a large-scale transformation program in Network Rail at the moment. I've been involved in 2 large transformation programs with data at the heart of them. So one that was running, it started 7 or 8 years ago. It was a program called Orbis, offering rail better information services. And now a secondary program that follows on from that, which I'm the head of delivery on, but also have a keen focus point area, touch point with all of the work that goes on around data. And that program is called Intelligent Infrastructure. And that is looking at moving us towards a much more predictive and preventative maintenance regime. That's really my sweet spot and where I sit within the organisation. But Network Rail is a really large organisation. It has 18,000 miles of track. It runs 22 to 24,000 trains a day. We're responsible for managing the infrastructure, maintaining the infrastructure, renewing it, and we're also responsible, as Nadoon talked about, for operating the infrastructure and setting the timetables. And in situations like this, it's obviously a very challenging time with COVID, where we've had to be dynamic and nimble about the way that we operate and adjust to the current times. My area of the business really focuses on the infrastructure side of things, but Network Rail as a whole has a huge focus on digital and use of data, and really has a big data-driven approach to everything it's doing at the moment. The infrastructure side, I'll talk a little about in a minute in the dialogue with Nadoon, but we're also moving towards building our digital railway. So moving towards better, more innovative train control systems that have come in from Europe and giving us that interoperability with Europe, but also building much better and innovative and exciting traffic management systems to support the way we manage the infrastructure. And Nadoon and the team at Deloitte and a number of other of our partners have been helping us along the way. So I think by way of introduction, Nadoon, that's me, and I'm happy to get into it now.
Alex, that's really brilliant. Before we jump into talking about the dynamics around what you have been already for a long time taking a data-driven approach to improving asset management, or whether it's network operations. Before we dive in to talk about the contrast between what we used to do and some emerging themes coming out after COVID, can you say a few words about how you and the organization been adopting a data-driven approach? Tell us a little bit about what the key benefits that you see in doing it, and benefits delivered, but also challenges that comes with it in terms of adopting that sort of an approach.
It's a big question to do, and there's a lot in there. I'll pick out a couple of the bits. I think when we started the journey 7 or 8 years ago, obviously the technologies were not quite as advanced as they are today. And really the start of our journey was around kind of organizing our data, bringing it all into one place, being able to see what we had in terms of data, look at areas where we wanted to improve data quality. And that has set us up really nicely for where we are now in terms of being able to exploit that data using the emerging technologies that are out there. I think that the other area to consider is, certainly the programs that I run and others within the organization, it's not just about the data, it's about the people as well, and understanding the needs and the requirements around people. So, we can have all the data in the world and all the technologies, but you have to really understand your customers, the customers within your own organization, and then end customers of what they're actually expecting. So whether it's freight users or passengers, understanding the levels of service and the reliability that they want, and how do we then take that in-house within our own organization and use data effectively to drive better and more effective decision making. So we've learned that along the way. We're getting much better at that now, and actually using our customers to drive the the way we build our decision support capabilities to enable us to move forward and support the public, and to support, importantly, I think in times like this, our other passengers. We've got a heavy freight usage in the UK as well, and times like this, that's really come to the fore as well. So really kind of a number of things in there is thinking about the people, thinking about how we use data, thinking about how we organize data, and then once you've done that, you can then start to exploit all of the technologies and emerging techniques and capabilities that are out there. So we started off that journey 7 or 8 years ago. Over the years, and working with partners like yourselves, the emerging capabilities, techniques like data science has come to the fore, and I'm sure we'll talk about kind of using science. We're looking at that a lot at the moment with the global pandemic, but I think all organisations are going to be moving more and more towards using science to make decisions rather than relying. And in some organisations like ourselves, we've had many years of reliance on standards and policies that have been there for a long time, and actually, it's especially at times like this where we can look to challenge those standards and policies and really, challenge the status quo, and really using a data science approach and a data-driven approach enables us to do that.
So Alex, as you say, it's always about the passengers, the commuters, and everything you do, everything we try to help you to do is about improving what Simon and Faye referred to previously about making the movement of people and goods better, right? And we've been consistently trying to apply both data and simulation and other techniques, data science techniques, to solve very complex problems in mobility and transportation. There are quite a few sticky, complex problems, right? Like capacity improvement, congestion and performance, and then on the asset side, how you actually identify assets to maintain, and looking at the criticality of some of those assets as well. So, but it'd be really useful to understand from your perspective around, as well as taking a data-driven, science-led approach pre-COVID. I understand, and I have heard many anecdotal stories about COVID creating a few new challenges that we now need to respond. Could you share some of those examples, or what do you think the post-COVID and contrast between the two?
Well, we've started, it's a really good point. We've started to see some of them obviously through the pandemic, and we've had to be nimble around how we adjust in the ways of working. And I'll come on to one or two examples in a minute there. I think, when we go even further onto the outside, come outside of this pandemic, there's still lots of unknowns. I think, we've heard that in the previous two discussions as well. I would say that, some tangible examples that we've seen, certainly on, my side of the fence within the organisation that we've been looking at, working with particularly our infrastructure maintenance colleagues, are kind of, as we've been changing timetables, reducing services, that's given us different challenges. So we've been reducing passenger services, but increasing freight services. Freight services often running on different lines and have a different impact. The types of trains they are, the rail wheel interface, and the dynamics there is very different. So when we're increasing traffic on the freight side of things, we're looking from a maintenance side of what do we need to do to those particular routes which have heavy freight traffic, and make sure that we can keep them running, and make sure that we don't have the types of infrastructure failures that we've had in the past that would cause us to have severe delays. And in times like this, we don't want that. So what we've been looking at doing is using the power of data science, looking at the capabilities that we've started to develop over the last year or so in this second transformation program that we're running at the moment, Intelligent Infrastructure. And we've tried to look at whether we can take small areas, use some of the algorithms that we're developing to try and do some predictions if we change the traffic. And a bit back, a lot of this, and they're doing all links together into the discussion before around scenarios and what if management. And I know you've got some stuff that you want to share shortly on some of the work that you've been doing with us on digital railway. But if we're changing the timetables and we're increasing freight, what does that do to our infrastructure degradation rate? So we've been developing algorithms to look at particular types of failures that can have catastrophic impact on the network and put the network down for hours and have and days and have knock-on consequences throughout the entire network. So we've been using the capabilities that we've been developing, even in our early prototype stages, to use some of the small areas and see whether it can give our infrastructure colleagues some confidence that when increasing traffic in those areas, we're not going to do excess damage to the track, or we can help them and predict areas where we'll say, actually, start increasing the level of maintenance in that area if you're going to increase the traffic flow through, because it's going to have an impact on the network. So those are real examples where we're really able to use the data science and the algorithms that we've been developing to help our colleagues. And I'm sure there's many more, but lots of anecdotally, I've heard from some of my colleagues in there's been quite a lot in the timetable arena. So, usually within our organization, we'll issue a revised timetable twice a year, but over the last 12 weeks, we've probably had 3 different timetable changes, reducing and going up, and that will change. So how do we have the right data to be able, and tools and techniques to be able to do that on a regular basis? And I think, that's what you alluded to before about, this is unprecedented. We don't know how to do this. We've not done this before. So we're learning along the way, but those are the types of things where data and the science around data will prove really, really valuable.
And Alex, given that you have already been on the journey to adopt data science and other techniques and tools to do this decision-making, planning and scenario planning, in many areas you're ahead of the curve. But what I'm hearing is a lot of organizations are being unable to use their traditional tools that relied on a lot of the historic precedents. Still pretty good under normal circumstances because it's data driven and led by the science. But the science now is very different, and the way you do your scenario modeling is very different. So what better way to sort of talk to you guys and give you guys some real examples than to show you some of the work Alex has done and some of the work that we help network well. First, what you see on the screen is what we call asset criticality tool that Alex and his colleagues use in the asset maintenance side. This is all about prioritizing and identifying criticality of assets based on the utilization of it and the impact it will have in case of a failure on the network. But let me ask Alex to tell us a little bit about the benefits of taking an approach like this, where traditional asset management has been about looking at the condition and applying lots of maintenance according to policy and standards. But you guys are enhancing over and above that procedure to be able to focus on critical assets. Do you want to say a few words about the approach you're taking here?
Yeah, I mean, this is the one example that we're working on of a suite of decision support capabilities, as you know, and you guys at Deloitte have been helping us as a supply chain partner with us, and we're learning lots from working with you guys as well. But this is one part of it. We have a number of different decision support capabilities that we're developing using, and really driven again off I'd say the engineering side and the data science side. So using our FAMICA approach, looking at our critical failure modes on the network. And then we take an asset by asset perspective and look at what can we do to our track, what can we do to our signals, what can we do to our electrification to make that better, understanding root causes, looking at degradation rates, and using the cloud and the power of the cloud and the technologies that are available to us to look at how we can improve there. What this tool then does is sort of brings all that together. So what we don't want to do is look holistically at the track and look singularly at the track and look separately at our buildings and our electrification. Is we want to be able to look at traffic sections and start bringing into play the types of traffic that we have on the network and look at the criticality of all of these assets that you can see on the screen there within given locations. And that's something that we've not really been able to do before, but the power of data and the power of data science and bringing it all together is now enabling us to do that. So this is one example of a number of capabilities that we're developing at the moment, which is, it's exciting times really. We've not really ventured into this before. We tried to do some of that, and we did it successfully in the first change program, but again, we weren't using the power of the cloud in the way that we are now, and we're spending time now building that platform in-house, working with our partners to do that. And I think we'll see the fruits of that. So very much the last 5-6 years has been about organizing the data, bringing some of that data together to inform and make initial decisions around how we best maintain the infrastructure. But that was more looking at kind of long-term planning and whole life cost management of the asset. Now we're really working with our maintainers on a day-to-day management to challenge some of the norms around maintenance. And this is a tool that will really help the kind of management within the maintenance delivery units, as we describe them in the UK, manage their assets as effectively as possible and pinpoint the critical assets and go and intervene on those assets. And this is really important.
And thank you, Alex. So I think the key theme here is being able to treat assets based on utilization. And again, in the current circumstances, utilization across the country, across the network, is changing all the time. On the next slide, what the audience will see, one more please, Maria. What you see here is exactly this, to the point of the simulation and what if scenarios we talked about before. And it's brilliant that Network Rail is adopting those technologies already. This is slightly outside of Alex's program, but Alex can say a few words as well. But if I may explain very quickly what the digital railway part of the Network Rail organization is doing, is trying to use simulation and data science as a perfect combination to do what if scenarios. So when we first started this in a pre-COVID, it was about before you, and if any of you are living in the UK, you would have heard about some timetable issues that the UK experienced. And the whole concept around this was, how do you actually test something before you publish it and apply it into the real world? So based on those experiences, Network Rail wanted to have a look at the use of AI, predictive machine learning, to learn from the past and then being able to test on a dynamic basis to see if a timetable can be robustly applied in the real world. Now, this concept is even more so applicable now, given all of the circumstances are different and things are changing on a dynamic basis. Traditional tools that gives you the same answer every time does not work. So therefore, what if scenario planning combined with simulation is making real sort of headway within organizations like Network Rail. Given where we are on the time, I want to get Alex to tell us his sort of thoughts that in order to wrap this up. On the next slide, very quickly, everyone can see some of the great benefits that Network Rail has published that's delivering by taking a data-driven approach to doing maintenance, doing operational planning, and execution. Alex, I don't know if you want to say a few words around the benefits, but wrap our conversation up with any parting thoughts around the importance of taking a data-driven approach, and any comments around what you see happening in the future as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, these benefits that we talked about here were for a specific area, specific project, but just more generally, I think, you know, from a rail perspective and using data, I mean, certainly on the programs that I've been involved in, and they are 2 large-scale programs, so I think, you know, Orbis, I think £180 million benefits there, and it was a £380 million program to run, and the program that we're running now, we have a £190 million program we're running with £180 million benefits attached with that, and there's a further funding potentially available for the latter part of this next control period, which will take it up to equally the spend of the of the previous program. So an awful lot of money is being put in and invested into developing and building capabilities which use data and harness the power of that to turn it into intelligence. So there's huge benefits to be had, absolutely. I think just to wrap it up, I think that, you know, there's the other part of that we come back to is the people part of this, Nadoon, as well, with the skills, and I think it was touched on in the previous, you know, making sure that you have a really diverse mix of people within the organisation, particularly playing in this space as well. So lots of different diverse thinking experiences that people have had globally across the world. You know, we really want to bring in, especially within Network Rail, people that have had different experiences. That diverse thinking is really important. And, you know,
it's a great statement to finish our conversation, Alex. Diversity being key to doing everything and solving problems going forward. I'm going to hand you guys back to Simon to conclude the session.
Brilliant. And thank you, Alex and Nadoon. I mean, we could have another 30 minutes on questions, but we are short of time. But I'll ask one which came to the audience from someone I suspect might live in the UK. And Alex, how does Network Rail maintain agility in the value creation process within a fairly rigid regulatory framework? I think that might be very rigid regulatory framework, but I'll leave you to decide.
I mean, it is a rigid framework, but we do have flexibility within there. So, I mean, you know, we've moved as an organisation. We've actually, you know, 10 years ago, if I think about when I first started, I think it's probably 12, 15 years ago now. But when I first started, we were a very, very centrally based organisation, very central based. But we've moved over the years to devolve into a very structured route-based structure, which has devolved the power and given accountability to regional and route directors. So to an extent, whilst we have levels of rigidity in there at the centre, there is still quite a lot of flexibility for our routes and regions to make localised decisions. And the push certainly from our chief exec is to do more and more of that. We're going through another reorganisation at the moment that is, you know, designed at putting passengers and freight users at the heart of that organisation. So it's rigid and it's not, if that makes sense. It's we do have the power to make localised decisions, and also, you know, on change programs like ourselves, you know, it's very difficult. It's challenging the norm, it's challenging ways of thinking. So in the technology space, our organisation is very used to operating in a very waterfall way, whereas we're now moving towards developing agile technology, and that for people in the organisation can be quite a challenge. But, you know, we are being given the freedom to do that and being there to challenge the norms and really promote people to think innovatively and creatively.
That's brilliant. And do you think, I mean, it's touching on something we discussed with Faye, is the modal silos. And do you see the fact that all this great work you've done about, you know, data and understanding and analysing is going to help you better to integrate the modals so you get this end-to-end mobility?
Yes, absolutely. And interestingly, one of the things I would say is that we, you know, I'd like to think that within Network Rail, we've been at the sort of forefront in the UK in this space, actually. And some of my old colleagues that, you know, I know you guys have worked with colleagues that have moved on to other organisations in the transport space within the UK, such as the Highways Agency, and we're, you know, now setting up similar types of programs in that space. So we've actually, I think, taken a lot of what we've done in rail, and that's been moved out into different transport, different parts of our mobile sector within the UK. So I very much hope that we do that. And in terms of sort of data sharing, which has been a topic, you know, I think within Network Rail we do share, and we do quite a lot in that space actually to make data open for people, and we've seen the power of that over the last 5 to 10 years with the entrepreneurs creating applications, apps that use our information to do that. So I think we do quite a lot of that already. There's a lot more that we can do. It's not the government promoting that and helping us do that.
I think that's a brilliant answer. I'm getting the nod that we need to finish now because it's such a rich discussion. And thank you, all of you, for sharing your views. Thank you, Thomas, Faye, Alex, and particularly my colleagues Piyush, Rana and Nadoon. If we haven't answered any of the questions which were put online, we'll answer them offline. The recording of this webinar is going to be available in the next few days and will be sent round to all the participants. And we're going to follow it up with an editorial in the coming weeks, which tries to draw some of the themes together. So a big thank you to all the panelists for sharing their insight and giving up their time. And an even bigger thank you for all of you around the world for making time to listen to us, contributing questions. And we hope we'll be able to keep a virtual dialogue going on such an important subject. So thank you very much. Take care. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Goodbye.